It's the spring of 1945. After 6 brutal years of war, the Allied forces had pushed deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The beaches of Normandy were long behind them. Paris had been liberated. The Rhine had been crossed. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was crumbling, building by building, street by street. From London to Washington, from Moscow to Ottawa, people were beginning to whisper a word they had barely dared to say for years. Victory. Newspapers were already being drafted. Champagne was being chilled. Mothers clutched photographs of their sons, daring for the first time to believe they might actually come home. Politicians rehearsed their speeches. Generals planned their victory parades. The world held its breath and smiled. But here's the thing about wars. They don't end cleanly. They don't stop the moment you expect them to. And the men who thought they had won, the statesmen, the generals, the ordinary soldiers, were about to discover something terrifying. The hardest part wasn't storming the beaches. It wasn't crossing the Rhine. It wasn't even taking Berlin. The hardest part was what came after. Stay with me, because this is the story that most history books skip. The chaos, the betrayal, the broken promises, the moment when the greatest military victory in human history began to unravel in ways no one had predicted, and the consequences of which we are still living with today. Let's go back to Berlin in April 1945. Adolf Hitler is hiding in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above him, his capital city is being torn apart. The Soviet Red Army, over 2.5 million soldiers strong, has encircled the city. German defenders, many of them barely old enough to shave, are fighting with their last bullets against one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever assembled. Hitler refuses to surrender. Even now, with the war objectively lost, he issues orders to phantom armies, divisions that no longer exist, generals who can no longer reach him. He talks of secret weapons, of miraculous reversals, of destiny. On April 20th, 1945, his 56th birthday, Hitler makes his final public appearance in the garden of the Chancellery, awarding medals to members of the Hitler Youth. Boys, some as young as 12 years old. The photographs from that day are haunting. Here is the most powerful dictator in European history, broken, trembling, barely able to lift his arm, surrounded by children he had sent to die for his delusions. 10 days later, on April 30th, with Soviet soldiers just hundreds of meters away, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his underground bunker. Eva Braun, his wife of less than 40 hours, took a cyanide capsule beside him. Their bodies were carried upstairs and burned in the Chancellery garden, per Hitler's explicit instructions. He didn't want to end up on display like Mussolini, whose body had been hung upside down from a Milan petrol station just 2 days earlier. Because that's the other story happening simultaneously. Benito Mussolini, the man who had called himself Il Duce, the supreme leader, the founder of fascism itself, was trying to flee to Switzerland disguised as a German soldier. He was caught, and within hours, he and his mistress Clara Petacci were executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies were then transported to Milan and hung upside down at a petrol station, Piazzale Loreto, for the crowds to see. The Italian people who had once roared his name in adulation now spat on his corpse. This is what the end of empires looks like. Not glorious, not cinematic, grotesque, undignified, human. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed on May 7, 1945 in Reims, France, and ratified on May 8 in Berlin. The Allies declared May 8 as Victory in Europe Day. V-Day. The celebrations were extraordinary. In London, hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets. Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health to thunderous applause. In New York, Times Square erupted. In Paris, people danced in the streets. In Moscow, Stalin announced the victory to his nation, and fireworks lit up the sky for hours. It was the happiest day the world had seen in a very long time. And it was entirely, absolutely, dangerously premature. Because the war wasn't over. Not even close. While Europe was celebrating, a different kind of war was still burning. A war that, in many ways, was more savage, more desperate, and more uncertain than anything that had happened in the West. The Pacific War. In the jungles of the Philippines, in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, in the twisted wreckage of Okinawa, the war against Imperial Japan was reaching its most horrifying crescendo. And unlike the German military, which had surrendered in a relatively organized fashion, the Japanese military was operating under a completely different set of rules. To understand why the Pacific War continued, and why it collapsed into one of the most destructive single decisions in human history, you have to understand how differently Japanese military culture approached the concept of surrender. Bushido, the way of the warrior, held that death in battle was honorable. Surrender was not just cowardly. It was shameful, unthinkable, a disgrace not just to the soldier, but to his entire family, his ancestors, and the emperor himself. This wasn't just propaganda. These beliefs were deeply embedded in Japanese military training. Soldiers were taught that to be captured was worse than death. To surrender was to cease to exist as a human being of worth. The result? Japanese soldiers fought in ways that seemed incomprehensible to their American, British, and Australian opponents. They would hold positions for months, sometimes years, after those positions had any strategic value. They would make suicidal banzai charges into machine gun fire. They would refuse to accept that battles had been lost. Take Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest, over 21,000 men, fought to the death. American casualties were staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed. Nearly 20,000 wounded. For 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, said this of the battle. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. It was a battle so brutal that even the victors were traumatized. And then came Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 180,000 American troops. The battle lasted from April to June 1945. 82 days of some of the most horrific close-quarters fighting in all of military history. Over 12,000 Americans killed. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed. And, in a detail that haunted American planners for decades afterward, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed. Caught in the crossfire. Forced into caves. Instructed by Japanese military authorities that the Americans would torture and murder them, and therefore many took their own lives rather than surrender. Okinawa changed everything about how American military planners looked at the final phase of the war. Because if one island, even a large one, cost that many lives, what would the invasion of the Japanese home islands cost? The estimates were terrifying. Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of Japan, projected American casualties anywhere between 250,000 and 1 million. Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially in the millions. Some planners estimated it could kill more people than the entire European theater of the war. Something had to give. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the United States detonated the world's first atomic bomb. The Trinity test. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the project, famously recalled the words of the Bhagavad Gita running through his mind as the fireball rose. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The bomb worked. It worked beyond all expectations. President Harry S. Truman, who had only been in office since April 12, following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, was informed of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, where he was meeting with Churchill and Stalin to negotiate the post-war order. On July 26th, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration to Japan, a final ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender. The declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japan's government, led by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, publicly dismissed it. Suzuki used the word mokusatsu, which can mean either no comment or to treat with contempt, and the Western press translated it as outright rejection. Whether it was a mistranslation, a political miscalculation, or a genuine decision doesn't change what came next. At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a single bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, detonated approximately 1,900 feet above the city with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed, vaporized, incinerated. Within seconds, the city center was gone. By the end of 1945, the death toll had climbed to an estimated 140,000, as radiation sickness, burns, and injury killed tens of thousands more in the weeks and months that followed. Survivors, the Hibakusha, described scenes of absolute horror. A city transformed in a microsecond into a landscape of ash and shadow. People who had been walking to work simply ceased to exist. Some left only their silhouettes burned into stone walls and concrete steps, permanent ghost images of the last moment of their lives. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly. Total deaths by end of year, up to 80,000. On the same day, the Soviet Union, honoring a commitment Stalin had made at Yalta, declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria with over 1 million soldiers. Japan was now simultaneously being bombed into the Stone Age from the air and invaded by the Soviets on the mainland. The Imperial Japanese government faced an impossible reality: continue fighting and face the complete annihilation of the nation, or surrender. The one thing their entire military and cultural code said was unacceptable. Emperor Hirohito made a decision that would break centuries of Japanese military culture. He recorded a radio address, the first time in history that most Japanese people had ever heard his voice, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration's terms. He did not use the word surrender. He said Japan would endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. But the meaning was clear. The war was over, or so everyone thought. Here is the part that the victory speeches didn't mention. Here is what the newsreel footage of cheering crowds didn't show you. The Second World War killed between 70 and 85 million people. That's not a statistic you can absorb in one breath. It's approximately 3% of the entire global population at the time. More than the population of Germany today. More than the population of the United Kingdom. Dead. But the dying wasn't finished when the surrender documents were signed. In many parts of the world, the chaos and death of war simply changed form. Across Europe, between 11 and 20 million people had been displaced, a clean word for an absolute catastrophe.
Jews were systematically dehumanized in the press, in films, in school curricula, in art, and in everyday public life. By the time the deportations began in earnest in the early 1940s, much of the German public had been conditioned to see Jews as something less than fully human, a danger to Germany, a problem to be solved, a category of person to whom normal moral rules might not apply. This dehumanization is a necessary precondition for genocide. And it meant that when rumors circulated about what was happening to the Jews in the East, many Germans were psychologically prepared to not care, or to feel that, whatever was happening, it was probably justified. That is different from not knowing. It is, in some ways, worse. There is another psychological dimension that historians and social scientists have examined: conformity. In a totalitarian society, expressing dissent is not merely uncomfortable, it is potentially fatal. And so most people do not dissent. They go along. They repeat the official story. They perform loyalty to the regime, even if privately they have doubts. And here is the disturbing thing about conformity. When everyone around you is performing the same ignorance, the same loyalty, the same acceptance of the official narrative, it becomes genuinely difficult to maintain your own independent perception of reality. The social pressure to conform is not just external. It reshapes how people actually think and perceive. Hannah Arendt famously wrote about the banality of evil. Her observation that many perpetrators of the Holocaust were not monsters or fanatics, but ordinary, bureaucratic people doing their jobs in an ordinary way. The same logic applies to bystanders. Many of the German civilians who claimed to know nothing were not, individually, evil people. They were people who had been systematically conditioned, through fear and propaganda and social pressure, to not know.
And then there were the survivors of the Holocaust. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in 1945, they found approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Jewish survivors in the camps of Western Europe alone. What they found in those camps shook even combat-hardened soldiers to their cores. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, insisted on touring the camps himself. He then demanded that journalists, photographers, and members of the U.S. Congress be brought to see what had happened. He later wrote in his memoir, "I have never felt able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality." The survivors could not simply go home. For most, home no longer existed. Their families were gone. Their communities had been annihilated. The countries they had lived in were often still deeply anti-Semitic. They were stranded, stateless, traumatized, and unwanted by much of the world. The question of what to do with the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust would become one of the most consequential geopolitical issues of the entire post-war era, and would reshape the map of the Middle East in ways the world is still grappling with today. Here is perhaps the greatest collapse of all, and the one with the most lasting consequences. The alliance. The Grand Alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union had won the war. These three powers, so different, so ideologically opposed, had set aside their differences to destroy Hitler. And they had succeeded. But the moment the common enemy was gone, the alliance began to shatter. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had met at the Yalta Conference in Crimea. They had agreed, or appeared to agree, on how Europe would be reorganized after the war. Free elections in liberated countries. A democratic future for Poland, for Czechoslovakia, for the nations of Eastern Europe. The United Nations would be established to prevent future wars. It sounded hopeful. But even as the signatures were drying on the Yalta agreements, Stalin was doing something entirely different. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern zone of Germany, Soviet forces and Soviet-backed communist parties were systematically taking control. Opposition politicians were arrested. Non-communist newspapers were shut down. Elections, when they were held at all, were rigged so thoroughly that communist parties won with suspicious majorities of 90 or 95%. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, who had by then lost the British election and was no longer prime minister, traveled to Fulton, Missouri, to give a speech at Westminster College. President Truman sat on the stage behind him. Churchill coined a phrase that would define the next 4 decades of global history. He said that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Behind that curtain lay the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe, Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all of them subject to Soviet influence. The Cold War had begun. The alliance that had saved the world had collapsed into a standoff that would last 45 years, and that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nowhere was this more visible than in Germany. The country had been divided into 4 occupation zones after the war. The Western zones, American, British, and French, gradually merged into what would become West Germany, a democratic state with a market economy, rebuilt with American money through the Marshall Plan. The Soviet zone became East Germany, a communist police state, the most surveilled society in history, where the Stasi secret police had one informant for every 63 citizens. Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was similarly divided. And in 1961, to stop the flood of East Germans fleeing to the west, the East German government, with Soviet approval, built a wall through the heart of the city. A wall of concrete and barbed wire and guard towers and death strips. The Berlin Wall. It would stand for 28 years. This was not what anyone had fought for. This was not the world the soldiers on the beaches of Normandy had imagined when they charged into the gunfire. This was not what the resistance fighters hiding in French forests, in Dutch attics, in Warsaw sewers had dreamed of. They had thought the war was won. And in a sense, it was. But something else, something cold and dark and decades long, had taken its place. The Second World War didn't just end the Nazi Empire and Imperial Japan. It ended the entire European imperial world order. Before the war, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal controlled vast empires across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. These empires had existed for centuries. They seemed permanent. They were not. The war had cost Britain its financial strength. The country was essentially bankrupt by 1945, kept alive during the war by American Lend-Lease aid, which had now ended. Britain could no longer afford to maintain an empire, and the people within that empire, who had fought for Britain, who had died for Britain, who had watched their resources extracted to feed the British war machine, were no longer willing to accept colonial rule. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, gained independence in August 1947. But the independence came with catastrophe. The partition of British India into 2 nations, India and Pakistan, was accompanied by one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Between 10 and 20 million people were displaced. Between 200,000 and 2 million people were killed in sectarian violence. Families were torn apart. Communities that had coexisted for centuries turned on each other in weeks. The British had ruled India for 2 centuries. They left in a matter of months, with a border drawn by a lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe who had never even been to India before. The consequences of that rushed, poorly considered partition are still being felt today in the tensions between India and Pakistan, both now nuclear-armed states. The British had also made conflicting promises in the Middle East during World War I, and those chickens came home to roost after World War II. The Holocaust created overwhelming pressure, particularly in the United States, to establish a Jewish homeland. Britain, exhausted and unable to manage the situation in Palestine, handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. In May 1948, Israel declared independence. The very next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. The First Arab-Israeli War began, a conflict that has continued, in various forms, for the 75 years since, and shows no sign of ending. In Southeast Asia, France tried to reclaim its colonial empire in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia after the Japanese occupation ended. The Vietnamese independence movement, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, refused to accept a return to French rule. The First Indochina War began in 1946. France was defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam was partitioned, north and south. And then the United States stepped in, afraid of communist expansion, and took over France's failed war. The result was the Vietnam War, which would kill over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians, and would shatter American society, destroy a presidency, and traumatize a generation. All of this flows directly from the decisions made and not made in the final days of the Second World War. We've talked about geopolitics, about empires and borders and bombs. But let's talk about people. Over 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the Second World War. When the war ended, they came home. They came home to parades and celebrations and ticker tape and the life they had dreamed of in the foxholes and the jungles and the bombers at 30,000 feet. And many of them found that they couldn't quite fit back into that life. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not yet a recognized diagnosis. The men who had seen their friends obliterated by artillery, who had cleared houses room by room, who had liberated concentration camps, who had survived kamikaze attacks, they came home and were expected to get a job, buy a house, start a family, and get on with it. To be normal. Many couldn't. Alcoholism rates among veterans were staggering. Domestic violence. Nightmares. What they called in those days combat fatigue or shell shock. Men who had been heroes in Europe or the Pacific found themselves sitting in their garages in the dark, unable to explain to their wives or their children what they had seen, what they had done, what had been done to them. For the veterans of color, the black soldiers who had fought in segregated units, the Japanese-American men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who had fought with extraordinary distinction while their families were held in internment camps back home. The homecoming was particularly cruel. They returned to a nation that had used their service, but was not yet willing to grant them full equality. The civil rights movement that would transform America in the 1950s and 60s was fueled in no small part by the righteous fury of black veterans who had died for democracy abroad and came home to Jim Crow laws. In September 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender documents were signed. The Second World War was officially over. The cameras clicked. The dignitaries shook hands. General Douglas MacArthur declared that it was his earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge. It was a beautiful sentiment, and it wasn't entirely wrong. The post-war world did produce the United Nations, however flawed. It produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It produced the European project that would eventually end centuries of war between France and Germany. It produced the longest period of peace between great powers in recorded history. But it also produced the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the proxy conflicts that killed millions in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and dozens of other countries. It produced the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. It produced the trauma of colonialism's violent end. The men who signed those surrender documents thought they had finished something. And they had. But they had also started something. Something that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still living through right now. History never ends. It mutates. The walls come down and new ones go up. The empires collapse and new powers fill the vacuum. The survivors of one catastrophe build the world that produces the next. This is not a pessimistic observation. It's a human one. Because understanding how the victory of 1945 crumbled, how the greatest triumph in modern military history gave way to new forms of suffering, new conflicts, new injustices. That understanding is not an exercise in despair. It's an exercise in humility. And humility, perhaps, is the one lesson that every generation needs to relearn. They thought the war was won. In some ways, it was. In others, it never really ended at all. Thank you for watching. If this video moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please subscribe, share it with someone who loves history, and let me know in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? I read every comment. Until next time, stay curious.